So we're back with views. We talked about them a little bit, but I want to go kind of to a higher level on, well, okay, so why do you need views? What's the point of views? Why are they there? Why is my mouse? There it is. Oh, do this to me. There we go. So you who are on the front end out at your organizations have particular things you want to get done. You have workflows. And the point of TDM is to support that. If it doesn't support it, you're going to have to change what you're doing to make software work, and that's backward. Software needs to be configured to work for you the way you want to work. So the current data in TDM is pretty much PPDM standard stuff we've heard over the years from customers. Those of you who saw it way back in the dark ages when we first started are looking at it now thinking, oh, there's probably some more useful stuff in there than in the very beginning. That's good. That's because we've learned from you. But when you think about the data that's in TDM, it can always be better. It can always have more. It can always be richer, more defined, more flexible. And the question would be, when you're thinking about how to configure TDM to work for you, given the data in TDM, just think of it first that way, what data in there supports the workflows you need to perform as a business? So if you have a team of people in charge of, for example, bringing in acquisition data, you've acquired a healthy chunk of Anadarko's wells, Sanchez, I think you guys just did that. And now you've got this mass of wells to bring in. What is it that you want to chunk out as far as getting that data into TDM properly? If it wasn't all given to you in files, you need to then create data entry workflows. So you need to have things like well level manager organized with all the fields displayed you need entered, or bulk data editor displaying all the views with things you need entered. So you need to think about, okay, well, what do I need to get in and how do I need to get it in? If you can get it in files, it would be awesome to use Loader, either using Dropbox or the UI, create spreadsheets, create files of some kind, have them be either generated and thrown in a Dropbox at 3 a.m. so then they come into the system when no one's using it, or I need to have people actually scouring it and scrubbing it on the way in to make sure it is coming in correctly. So is there additional data that I would like to bring in? Sure. Could it be, does it fit into a PPDM table structure somewhere? Is there currently a column that would house this, or that means the same thing as the data I want to bring in? Great, yes. If not, does the auxiliary table have a place where I can house this data? Does it need to be blended and aggregated? That would be a question to answer before you decide whether I need to put it in WellOps, or whether I could use another child table, or like, well, miscellaneous data to house miscellaneous stuff that doesn't need to be blended or aggregated. I just need it connected to my wellbore, or my completion, or whatever version that I have of the wellbore or the completion. And then in what form is it available is the other question of, well, do I need to hand enter it? Is there a file I need to bring in? Is it just images that I need to connect to components? How do I need to bring it in? So you got to think through all of this stuff when you're saying, if someone says, you know, Brian, I really need a view to show this data on interests, you know, my before payout, my after payout data. Well, where are you going to get that data from? What does it look like? Do you have it in a file? Do I have to enter it manually? Is it in a spreadsheet already? What does it look like? So you need to think about the workflow you need to do. What data needs to come in? Blended and aggregated would be the key question now that we've talked about WellOps to think about to decide whether or not you want to use one of those 30 valuable spots in the WellOps table for that piece of data. Because I guarantee you before the year is out, you'll fill up most of those spots as you think through bringing in more data. I know QEP has already maxed it out. So what we're looking at is, okay, if we bring in new data, how do we get it in? So suppose I can bring the data in to support my workflow. Is the data that I bring in displayed correctly in my views? So when I look at the home page and I see those 29 views under data views, and I go, okay, it's not in the completions view, it's not in the general view, it's not in the well audit view, it's not in any of those views. I need to create views to display it, because there's nothing worse than searching for something and then not being able to see it. So I need to create views, and along with that I would add, well, level manager probably needs to show it if it's blended and aggregated. If I've added that data, I need to then write query parameters to find that data. And along those lines, keep in mind that any views that you define for the home page are by default available on the export manager. But keep in mind, taking that backward, if I need views specifically to export data out of TDM, and I write them, then they're also going to be available on the home page. So there's both sides to that. Depending why you write the view, it's still going to be available in both places. Once you decide what data you need to bring in, how you need to bring it in, how you need to make it visible and searchable and exportable, are there any other areas of TDM that are impacted by this or that are not involved in this? So if I have, for example, reports that cover most of the territory around this piece of data, but not all of it, do I need to customize those reports? And right now they're not truly customizable out of the box as like a configuration thing, but you could in theory write your own, or we could work with you to customize them. Does the bulk editor need to show things? Not only do I need to add this to a visible view, but does it need to have triggers attached to it so that, for example, Ryan had a good question at the break again about if I wanted to know my operator history and I wanted to have an effective date and an expiry date and know for time eternal every operator that ran this well and dealt with it from the driller all the way on to the current owner, and I wanted to know over time who operated it when, do I need to then create triggers, which is what QEP actually did, to every time I expire a well to give me a new blank row to enter the new one with an effective date of the same date as the former operator expired to put in the new operator. And the same thing on backward. If I only have data from 1992 onward and I get data from 1986 through 1981, I need to be able to enter that data as well. So think about any database triggers that you need to create new rows for data entry purposes, or if there are constraints that need to be put in place. If I bring in, I can't even think of one, a new kind of operator, not initial current operator, not initial or / original operator, not current operator, maybe there's some other kind of operator, or something else that uses the business associate table, like a partner. So if I have a business partner, do I need to make sure that those values are limited to only the data values that are in the business associate table? Do they need to be in that table as an operator? So you need to think about when you add new information, what else needs to change to make that happen? Excuse me. We did look a little bit right before lunch at the result grid views. Everything you're going to see in the result grid, the result views.config XML file that configures that relates to what you see on the page, including things like coordinate reference system conversions, measurement conversions. There are 2 sections in every one of those views right now that will, for example, the one that's highlighted, that will take current location values, latitudes and longitudes, and make them sensitive to the session coordinate system that a user has specified. Have you all seen that on the home page where you can change your coordinate reference system? And you've seen what it does to data if you pick like NAD 83 New Mexico East for something that's really supposed to be NAD 27. where you now have, massive numbers of feet from a central point in the state instead of a latitude, longitude value, and that completely freaks people out if they don't look at it correctly. So we see that happen a lot when people have combined together Colorado data with Texas data with data in New England somewhere, and then they assign like a NAD 83 New Mexico or NAD 27 Texas Central, North Texas Central. And those numbers look crazy. They look right for some of the rows and wrong for others. So you have to really play that carefully. This is the piece, though, within those views that makes any latitude, longitude value sensitive. We actually turned this off for Anadarko for a while because they said, I only want the raw and global values out there. I don't want anyone seeing anything converted to anything but NAD 27 or WGS 84. That's it. So they actually turned that off initially. Actually, they recently just turned it back on. For the last year, they've implemented with it off because they did not want to see that conversion present, at least in front of the users' faces. The other piece in the measurement side is for those in the room who work in the metric world. You can actually set that to be sensitive to if you change your measurement system to, I think we call it global or I can't remember what it's actually called. I haven't used it. Canadian or global, where it's metric based rather than foot or inch based, that kind of thing. So all of those things matter in terms of how the data is displayed. Some of the other things you see on the columns, where it's type of data, all of those names, name, EIQ, UE, government ID, source, and OBS number, are things delivered by the database view that is defined here. So your database view, EIQ, well, comp, header view, all of the views in TDM are in the energy IQ schema. And in the energy IQ schema, the EIQ views are views that energy IQ has written. I believe there may have been some PPDM views that we absconded with that may still be sitting there as is, but these are all EIQ, Energy IQ custom delivered views in which we present data keyed by the E key. So EIQ UE is the key for these. The name of the view is always here. It has a unique alias. If you are creating new views, make sure it has a unique alias. And these are the keys on this particular view. This is the completion view. So in addition to the key that I mentioned before as the key on all the views, EIQ UE, we also have source and observation number. There's a completion obs number as well as a source, because this is a version specific or source specific piece of information, these completions. Everything in here has a meaning. So your default width, you've seen cases where you have data that doesn't seem to fit in a column and you keep having to expand it. Please be sensitive to the kind of data you're bringing in and make sure the column is wide enough if you're defining a new view. That makes people crazy. And there are a couple of other things in here. There's a sort ordinal, which is going to tell you right off the bat, I want this to be the primary sort, ascending order for this piece, for this view. So by E key will always be the default sort there, and obs number will always be the secondary sort. You can always assign that or change that in the view itself by resorting it, but right out of the gate, that's what's going to display. So there's different kinds of views. We have views that are used in the home page up here. Any view that you see on the home page when you first go in here can also, except for the ones that are obviously trees to start with, any of these other views can be used as a subview on another view. As long as it has EIQ UE. You want, now I say any, you want to make sure they have the same key. Right? So if you have the key of EIQ UE, anything else with the key of EIQ UE can be a subview under that, like we saw with the header view here and the documents, logs, digital logs, raster, and directional surveys. being subviews under that. You can also go into those independently over here, but they can be defined as subviews across. Going clockwise, the general view is what's always used when you bring Query Manager results back. So if you change the general view, that comes up first on this page, on the home page, that will then reflect on the Query Manager page. Any of the views you've defined here can also be called in by the bulk editor. So if you wanted to have a very Toad-like front end on your data and be able to edit data right in TDM, which is what QEP is currently doing, and a couple other customers are using one or two of them, you can do that here. You can also define very specific views to be used here. The same views in the export page match the views in the home page. If you change something about the general view here, you'll see it in Query Manager and in the export page. Generally, you should have the same kind of information, if not exactly the same information, in the well level manager that you have in a view in the home page. Because the way folks will use it, because you need to go to a page like this that has e-key links to get to well level manager anyway, folks expect to see in the well level manager the same kind of things they see in the view when they go into the home page.
So your point about the general view is so if I run a query, my results always show up in the general view. Is that what that's saying?
Yes.
See, we have, I don't think we ever use our general view. In fact, the next question was to get rid of it because we actually have, we call it a industry view. And that's a defined thing that we came up with. But as far as I know, we display our results in industry.
I say general view in a generic sense. It's your whatever your default view is. Your first view.
Our default. Okay.
Your default view.
Which is our.
Yes. For you, it is different. Yeah. Sorry. I'll be more specific. I'll actually change that one before Steve steals this slide.
So we do have one called general view, and it's just a name up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Use it. So I guess my next question is, can I actually get rid of that without any sort of impact?
I think so.
Or is that baked in?
One way to find out.
Do a test.
Yes, please do a test. Yeah, I'm usually the person in our company that'll click OK first and then think later. But that's how I find stuff out, right?
Okay.
You can always comment it out, which I'm betting it is.
Well, it's in our drop down, but when you land on our team page, it's as you say default to our industry.
Yes.
That is what comes up. That's what when you run queries, that's what displays the results.
Yes. I think Paul changed something specifically to make that happen. I'd have to ask him exactly what he changed.
Okay.
You know Paul Wood, right?
Oh, I don't know.
Yes.
I can't.
Yep. He's a good one. He lives in Houston now, if you knew that. Yes, he moved to Houston and so did Joseph, so you're a hotbed for activity here. This is a QEP view. I promised them I would blank out anything very sensitive, so I did. This is a really good example of how they're using views to support workflows. What they have done is within their well lists, within their wells, I just have a particular list called well list, and I brought in a few of their different wells. What they've done is they have actually created subviews within the header to display different information, specifically in this case, the status timeline, from effective dates, what was the status during what time frame, really helpful. The class timeline and an operator timeline. Brian, this is where you would do something what you were talking about, is actually have an operator timeline. In this case, this was the first record they have, 2013 onward. But I've seen records they have where they go back 100 years and they know their operators for the last 100 years. Extremely helpful. especially with, litigation issues like that. Who owned the well when? And all of these views that they have put as subviews here are also available individually in the list. So that was the short and sweet on views. The reasons you're going to create views are typically to support information somebody wants to see somewhere. And when you create a view or change a view to include new information, you need to be aware of all the places. That's the reason for the other side of where else that is going to be seen. So if someone says, I want to see this on the home page, you can also then export it. You can also then see it in a variety of other places. So just be aware that if you think you're just changing the home page view, that's not true. Auditing. The reason we audit data is, well, there's a couple reasons you audit data. One would be that I have an MDM solution and I want a trigger on when something changes. And I want to have, SSIS jobs out there that will look for changes in data. And what you have to think about are what changes do I want to sense? Do I want to sense a change in a particular well version, source-specific record, or in the master golden record in well? Which table do I want to sense a change on? And that seems like a minor question, but it's a really important question. Because if I sense a change to a well version record, and it's not the source of record or the highest preference source that never actually rolls up to the golden record, if I did I say that wrong? In the well version, if I sense a change in well version and it never makes it to the golden record, do I care? Do I ever care? So you have to think about, does it matter? Does it matter to anyone? Does it matter to other systems? Most of the time you're going to go, no. I think the well and well ox changes are the ones I care about. I don't think I care about the others. There may be times when you do care about the others because you want to know if a really important system, even though it may not be the source of record for every attribute, if it has any change, I want to know. Keep in mind, though, that we accomplish auditing by putting database triggers on different attributes. And we can generate database triggers using a config file called audit code gen, or we can actually just write database triggers using SQL in the database. So there's two ways you can actually create a trigger, and several ways that you can use those triggers. The point of, I think most of you, except those that were not here yesterday, saw the Hunt presentation, how they're using triggers to trigger the MDM process, or how they're using audit history to do that. The table that data gets pushed into, so if you put a trigger on well name, very simple, a trigger on well name that says anytime well name is updated, write a record into the audit table. What it's going to actually physically do is, if you say upon insert, upon update, upon delete, you're going to get a record in the PPDM audit history table that records what happened. Old value, new value, date, who changed it. The IQ Insights process thinks that's very important because, I'm not sure if you caught the connection yesterday or if we explained it because I was not there for that piece. IQ Insights has an indexing process. It does not just go after the PPDM database as is. It takes that database and it synchronizes it with the Elastic database. That's what sits under IQ Insights. So if you have IQ Insights installed at your organization and you also have TDM installed on top of the PPDM database, those are two different databases. They're physically two different structures, and IQ Insights uses the PPDM audit history to make sure that it keeps the IQ Insights data in sync with the TDM database. Over time, I think Mike and Steve mentioned this, we are using more and more elastic structures within the TDM database. They will eventually dovetail, but right now they don't. Right now we synchronize. I know at Anadarko it's running every hour. In some cases it's running daily. Other people with perhaps huge computing power might run it on a real-time basis. So depending what it is you're doing, what you need. The IQ Insights process, and specifically, needs to understand deletes. That is the only way data can be deleted out of IQ Insights, is if there is a delete record written to PPDM audit history. So if you delete a well record, or well ox record, that needs to be recorded in audit history so that when IQ Insights synchronizes with it, it removes it from the IQ Insights database as well. Really, really important. And those of you who have IHS data loads coming in through WML or Pearls understand that the IHS change delete process is, I don't really have anything nice to say about it because I've been in the services side for a really long time. I've probably base loaded most of your databases at one point in my life, and the delete process makes us crazy. They will delete a well and the next day insert it, and they'll delete it the next day, and then they'll renumber it the next day, and then they'll delete it the next day. For I don't even know why. I can't even fathom the business process behind that. But sometimes we'll see deletes and inserts come in on the same day for the same one. And you just think, why? Why did that happen? So their delete process keeps us hopping, and we need to track that. When you make a change to this config file, as well as there is an audit scope table as well, we generate triggers. There is a process to actually generate those triggers in the database. Once they're generated, everything that changes after those triggers are in place, because they are insert, update, delete triggers at the database level, will be recorded to the PPDM audit table. You need to think very carefully about what you want to audit. We had one client that audited everything. Devin, that was you guys. That was your US folks for a while. They audited everything for a while and just about blew up their database. And there was a while where they couldn't even bring up the view because it was so big. So going back about an hour to my spiel on cleaning up your server, there's a point at which you probably can delete some of the audit history as well. So when you create audit history triggers, create them for a purpose, for a reason, understand how those audit history records will be used, and understand at what point you can probably get rid of them.
So when you create a trigger in here, what you're saying is you are actually just compiling a new trigger in.
Yes, this process will compile and create and generate SQL to generate new triggers out there.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. You can also write manual triggers that exist alongside them as long as they're differently named, and they'll persist even if you keep rerunning this and changing the triggers. Like we have, for example, we have some directional survey triggers that Chris has written out there that exist alongside triggers generated through this process.
Right. But the ones that she's compiled outside of this doesn't need to be aware of those.
Correct. Correct. You just make sure you don't want to duplicate those.
Right.
You really never want two triggers running on the same thing. It just takes forever. So your audit triggers depend on values existing in this table. This is an MDM table. It's not brand new, but it is a piece of the process in which you define these are the things out of the box that will deploy to you for well. We added for testing purposes in my group some well-ox version things. We really should be looking at well-ox, not well-ox version. We were just trying to see what would happen. You could do that, but out of the box we'll give you this. If you choose to audit more than this, you simply need to edit this table and bring information in. I did find a minor issue using the reference data manager in this table that we're going to fix soon, but you can always go to the database and insert records for this. There are a couple options: upon insert, upon delete, upon update. The question you need to think about is, okay, for the UE, I probably want to know when a new UE was created, when a UE was generally deleted, because that's going to cascade to the rest of the well. And when it was updated, if that happens. That's typically an odd change delete scenario. But things like well name, KB elevation, do you care when they're inserted or do you care when they're updated? When it's first brought in, actually when it's first brought in from null to real value, it's an update. So that will come through. So we have it as an update. Keep in mind, if you are entirely a PI shop or IHS data from Petroleum Information PI source, and you never get other data, you're going to get full records in from IHS with every load. So you're going to have a base load from us, and then you're going to have new data or change data as it comes in. You're not going to have as much activity as someone that has data like Concho from 7, 8 different sources potentially coming in. The way, and I learned this last week, I didn't know this. If you want well level manager changes to be captured, you need to set a trigger or a value on rather in your app settings file. This is yet another config file sitting in the TDM config directory that says property auditing value equal yes. For whatever reason, someone in my group had turned it off, and I couldn't figure out why auditing wasn't working. And then I realized there's actually a config setting that was turned off that I need to turn back on if I want my well level manager changes to be captured. Outside of that, controlling well level manager, audited changes include deletes to levels of a well, components, deletes of well versions within a well, and then any other situation that's manually identified in a manually created audit chart. Anything in the PPDM audit history table that we put there can be viewed in the well audit view on the homepage. And this was the view that I think Matt Hollingsworth could not get to come up for a while. He couldn't figure out what it was, and it turns out they'd never deleted out the PPDM audit history table, and it was like 20 million rows of yeah, I think they've done a good job of cleaning it up now. But again, that's another thing that you don't think about. I'm horrible at cleaning out my email. I think I have every email since the beginning of time. I treat it like a database. And I think that's not the right approach, according to many of my colleagues who laugh at me. Like, why do you have 60,000 emails? I don't know. Might need them someday. But, so you probably don't want to take the same approach when you're dealing with your server, though. It's going to really slow it down. The one piece here to keep in mind is we have a PPDM GUID that sits out there in all of the well tables that matches up to that row UID. So all of those things in rows 1 through 6 there happen to the same well. And that again was a Paul Abood well in Essex County, New Jersey, where that was the GUID on the well that he was dealing with, that he was updating. So it always ties back. Auditing is really not that exciting or that interesting. It's just there. So we'll move on if you're ready to blending, because I think blending is way more interesting. And then we'll go into TDM for a little bit and show you a few more things in the views.
Should we take a break and then knock it out?
Yeah, 1:30. Is it break time? Did I blow by it?
We didn't.
Is it?
No, you were gonna get back.
Is it?
And then when we were right back.
I think I sped through some things. Yeah. Isn't the break at 2:30?
The enhanced blending and aliases comes after the break bridge.
It does. Okay. Do you guys want to go into TDM now, or do you need to go warm up somewhere? Want to keep going? Let's keep going. because I tried to build in time to play to show you in TDM some of the things that you see on the slide. I think when you see things in a PowerPoint presentation, you go, well, I don't know, what does that really look like, or how did you actually get to that point? So all of the views that I have displayed on this side are things that I could, in theory, bring underneath this. And we started looking at the result views.config in here. So when we do this, and I'll connect to our database as well so you can see that. I'm just in the process of trying to reblend our test server because I accidentally deleted the blending hierarchy. I found a bug. A bug that allowed me to delete it by accident. So I fixed that. So I'm on somebody's list for doing that, so I got to finish reblending it. In our energy IQ schema, I mentioned there are, in the wrong schema, in the energy IQ schema, every view that you can access is listed. Most of the time, the EI, let's go to the top. Am I in the wrong? Here we go. The EIQ well query results view is going to be the source for much of the data we work with. At Anadarko, they have a specifically written view. At Sanchez, you have a specifically written view that are different. I think there are 2 other clients that have specifically rewritten views that pull from the database. And this is typically where we've had a solutions architect on site that has brought in way more information into that for other purposes, to create other workflows or trigger other activity. So everything that I can do here, when I'm looking at the result views.config file that controls what I see in the views, is based on what's delivered in that table. So everything that I see coming up in the EIQ well, we may be playing with some things in here, but the well query results view here, all of the values that I see here are available to use in the views. Most of them are used in the views, but if you find something else that's delivered, by all means, you can display it in some way that makes sense. We also use other views, but this one is the basis for not only the general view, but it is the basis for the header data that shows up. If you look at the, what is that? Okay, that was weird. Huh, okay. The production view, even though this is production data, TDM is guilty of being well-centric. And well-centric to a degree that we don't even allow you to look for entities based on their own merit as PDENs. We force you to go from the well to the production level. So even in the production view, we will be displaying for you the well header data across the top, and then within that well header, any production tests, cumulative values, etc., which I should look at the completion level for. One of the things you can do to ensure you have good test data, I didn't plan on showing that, so I didn't prep anything, is we can use data types here to figure out, this again is a binary query. Remember we looked at the different, in Query Manager, you have binary things that say if it exists, yes or no. This is an example of how those are used. So if I say show me production data, oops, in Weld County, Colorado, And I put that in my query panel and run it. Sorry, it's 01, I think. If I replace the definition, anyone else done that before? Change your query values and you don't replace the definition? It doesn't work. Oh, okay. Someone has removed all that data. I apologize, I'm on a test server. Let's try Loving or Andrews. That's better. Let's get it down a little bit. Perfect. Now, if I want to see this data that I've retrieved using a pretty specific query on the query page, here's a quiz. How do I see it in a different view? Because this is the general view. Yes. How? Yes. There you go. Just to see if you're awake. So the homepage icon will take all the data that you have here and open it. Typically, your homepage tab will remain open if it was open already, and it'll just be highlighted if it's something new that's happening in it. We used to have in prior versions, perhaps in your version, where you can have multiple homepages open. That annoyed Steve so much during his demos that he had development change that, so it always updated the current home tab. And I think there's only one exception where it doesn't. That makes sense. I can't remember what it is. And did it? Oh, that's funny. Didn't I look for Texas wells? Yes. I looked for, right. So what I actually looked for were Andrews County. I finally found some in Andrews County, Texas, that had production data. And that should be what I'm seeing here. Yes. Yeah, it might have just updated slowly. I think we're using the server for multiple things today. I've requested people not do anything really awful on it while I'm doing demo, but, you know, there are other people like me out there. I was waiting for you to ask that question. I've been looking for that for a while, and we are in the process that's sort of, when we all sort of came to the same conclusion that the quick search no longer does anything dramatically different than the query. I think at one point they were very different. But now that they're really diverging or converging, and they're doing almost the same activity, it would make more sense to have those together. However, what we're now grappling with is we've moved now into IQ Insights as a primary front end for searching data. And how much effort do we want to take to combine these two pages if we're moving toward having IQ Insights really be the front end that we use to send data into this as a management tool? So we're wondering if, I think what may eventually happen is the quick search may go away, query may become the primary, and IQ Insights be the main search layer. So this is, we're almost getting into a product strategy that we're really grappling with right now, is where do we want to throw effort? Once you bring it into your homepage, I think that's a good well too. In Well Level Manager, what we can see is this is a pretty sparse one, but when I look in the homepage, on the production header, if I look at that tree icon next to there, I know because I've brought up wells that do have production data that I'm going to have 5 tabs on here that will bring up data that makes sense, production data that makes sense underneath these. There is still no way in the Query Manager to use PDEN as a search criteria, and I don't know if we'll get there here. I know that we can already do that in the IQ Insights model, where it is not necessarily well-centric in the same way that TDM is well-centric. You can look for documents, rasters, logs, and I don't know if production is out commercially yet. I believe that is coming as well, where you can look for an entity within a well and then bring up all the well data associated with that has that as production data. Now, it doesn't mean you can load pro count data before you load well header data, but it means that if you have pro count data or other production data from IHS or PDB in there, that you could then find that and find everything associated with it. And in here, what Steve was talking about, and I know Anadarko has grappled with this, between their PDB internal production data source and IHS production data is, well, blending wells. I think Laredo has talked about it for a while. I know Anadarko has talked about it, has said, well, how do we blend wells? And Steve's answer is a good one, is, well, on what? I mean, what if you have monthly data in one and weekly in the other? Do you somehow fabricate one up to the monthly level or take the monthly down to the week level by some algorithm and figure out if they match? I mean, if you don't have the same unit, month, annual, year-to-date, day, week, how can you possibly blend it? So this is where we run into an issue with not only displaying it, because now, if we had PDB data in here, we would have now two sources of data. It looked like we'd have everything duplicated. So they have a challenge at Anadarko of, when they display data, showing one or the other. Like, which one do you want to see now? Because if you use both, you're going to double count your data. And we have the same issue with if you have lease data and reported data, where if you have a lease that has been allocated to multiple wells and you also have production records that have come in at the reported level, you could potentially double count that. So I think that's an IHS struggle we have right now, is trying to figure out how we can get that more cleanly from them, but we also have to think about the blending issue. The production test data is stuff that comes in. Keep in mind, none of this is blended, and none of this is actually going to be, if you'll notice, these are all completions. They're not well bores and they're not wells. So the production data exists at the bottom of the hierarchy, which is where currently we load this data, is at the completion level. And it exists only for the sources that have provided it, which is right now most of the time only IHS. So these are views that are based on, the header is based on the IHS, or rather the well header. And then if I go down to so the EIQ well query results view, we had a specific geographics one we were testing for a bit. We have an injection, log curves. Sorry. My hands are cold. There we go. So in our production view, in order to accomplish that, we actually have reading from the header here, and then reading from other IDs. So when you see these IDs in here, the prod summary view is a child view on there that displays, but it is a view in its own right. Oops. It exists in its own right down below. And the way you link child views is by ID. So anything with prod summary, if I see an ID prod summary, I'm going to look down below. So yet another reason to make sure you don't duplicate IDs or captions in any of the config files. You'll note that there's keys in here that differ. When I mentioned you can have subviews as long as they share the same key values, the one place that doesn't hold true is here in the production view, because I have a well header on top of the production data. And the couple of tables that are going to link a well ID to a PDEN or an entity, whichever way you're thinking about it, There's only 3 tables where that actually is going to happen. 2, one on the leaf side and 2 on the reported side, where you have any sort of relationship connecting those two. And that's what we use when we bring in the production view. So we have well tests, and in that well test view, we're going to have different key fields that will actually, behind the scenes, it will look through the PDEN and all the PDEN child tables to bring that in together. How many of you folks are comfortable with SQL in terms of creating views in SQL or modifying them? Do you have comfort level with that? You don't have to understand that to deal with this, but I'll give you just a really quick, even those of you who don't normally work with it, it won't be complete Greek. Close, but not complete Greek. So if you were to look at this view, EIQ well test header view, in the database. So the well query results view is what gave us our header information, and EIQ well test header view. Yes. We're going to see that all of the stuff that I wanted to display here is coming in from the production side. And feel free when you go back to your organizations to look at how some of the views bring information in. I am joining a whole pile of tables here to create each of these views. So when you think about a new data source supporting a new workflow coming into TDM, you need to very, very carefully think about, if I want to bring data in, what level do I want to bring it in at? What can I connect it to that would make sense? If you're bringing in production data, you want to make sure you're only joining to the well table on the completion level, if that's the only level at which you've got production data recorded. And you want to sort of, in your head, figure out what's going to be the most efficient way to do that. My well nodes, location data is also a little tricky here. If you are joining to your well node data, you'll notice that we have left outer joins. If you want to take a nap right now, you get time. So the left outer joins here, not that you couldn't understand it, but it's just like, you don't ever want to have to deal with it. You should never have to deal with it. It's interesting. Yes, it is. The left outer joins are going to make sure that you still get the data you wanted, even if there's no surface node. Same thing, even if there's no bottom hole. Sometimes we get header data way before we get the surface location data, and way before we get the bottom hole. Notional wells, you sometimes don't see that for quite a while. And you need to be really careful when you're writing views to support data to bring into visible views, how you write the database code that delivers those data elements right up front. This is probably where you're going to spend dealing with the intricacies of what really exists where. 75% of the time you want to bring in new data, you're going to be spending it mucking around in creating the view correctly, and making sure that what displays in a whole variety of scenarios actually makes sense. So you want to make sure you've got some wells that do and don't have nodes of different kinds, that you want to have wells that do and don't have production data, so you know that you're getting it correctly and not getting it correctly, that you're indicating if it's a lease correctly. There are all kinds of things you need to consider when you create a view to deliver data to display in a visible view. One of the other views here, sorry, I'm trying to remember, EIQ well audit view. This is the view that supports, see it. the view that supports the PPDM audit history, the well audit view that we saw on the home page. So when we thought about what do we want to show in that view, we had to think about, all right, I might have something in the PPDM audit history table, but I have to be careful about how I join it to the well table. So what we did is we had to create all the scenarios that were possible. It still existed, and it was a change that was reported in audit history. It was only in audit history and had been deleted from well, and union all those together. So the other scenario when you're creating views to bring data into TDM to be visible is to consider, would it ever still exist in one table versus the other if I want to display data from both the well header and the audit history that said what was the specific change in the data element that I want to display. So in this case, we're actually taking one where we have joined these together, where there's data in both the well table and the audit history table, unioning that with situations where I have data in well version in audit history, unioning that with where I have well area data here. So there's all these scenarios where I want to bring things in certain scenarios or other scenarios, because I don't know which could be true at any given moment in time. So there's some good examples. If you need to do any new work, create new views in all of these tables here, and in order to understand how these display, you can look for EIQ well audit view. You can just do a search for that in the resultviews.config and find out, okay, which view is that I click on? You know, it's audit, well audit. And then if I look at well audit in TDM, what does it actually display? So there's already some beginning to end examples of the database view, how it's used in result views to configure it to show correctly, and then what does it really show right now? If I look at TDM and bring up that view in TDM, oh, well audit history, the well audit view in the home page will display for me for the wells I have selected that have production data, nothing. If I were to take off my parameters, so what I did, and this is something that you might run into as well, is I went to a view here with a particular data set in mind. If I come into this window from Query Manager with these 90 wells in hand, only those 90 wells are going to be what's considered here no matter what view I go into, until I do something different, until I say, I want to see the audit history on all of the Andrews County wells. Sure, go for it. And I want to see all of the audit history that's behind all these, and there may not be that much. Typically, I'm probably going to see inserts and updates on these. The reason that is spinning so much is something we're changing right now. Right now we are actually doing a row scan on the PPDM GUID that's sitting in the audit table. So we're actually adding, coming up in I just talked to Mike last week, in 2017.1 we are adding UE as a row that's always captured in PPDM audit history. So if you have anything based on audit history, you're going to have to remember there's a modification coming to add a column to it. So it's going to tell us that we have 25 audited rows. Now this is because we temporarily had our audit triggers turned off in our test database. But what it's going to give us, that audit view that we created is going to tell us for every record here. So this is, for example, so I can see it better. We at one point had a trigger on well version. And you're going to see as you change your triggers over time, you get different results. So be careful of doing that as well. We're going to see well where I had an old value and a new value. That's a very clear thing on an update. And who modified it? You may be wondering, well, there's no modified by date. These are scenarios where we had not defined within the Active Directory structure, we had not been passing through, when we were testing this, the actual user ID. If I were a TDM customer and I saw blank in the modified date in an audit table, I would start screaming. So what we were doing here and what we are working on right now is making sure that in all scenarios we are correctly passing through the user who initiated the change to the record, right? And part of that was due to that I had property auditing turned off in Well Level Manager, so it wasn't capturing any of those changes. And some of there were generic changes coming through from an application that was modifying or bringing in integration we were testing that was bringing data in that wasn't passing in to EIQ source the right value of what the application name was. And in some cases, if it's like a loader or Dropbox initiated load coming through, you don't know who the user is. You know it's the Dropbox loader process. And you would have to then track that back. By default, no. If you turn on audit triggers, yes. So if you, good question, the triggers I said that are out of the box that come in that are audited, yes. So well inserts, updates, deletes, changes to KB elevation, well name, etc. If you don't add anything more to that pile, that's all you're going to see, is just those. On those tables that you have in there, yes. And we don't run WML regularly against this test database, only because we test odd scenarios. We have a different database that we use for testing WML changes. It's a good question, though. I'm not sure if there's a way to turn that off for just that application. Yes, I would think you would want that, right? I would absolutely think you would want to see that. If IHS is changing, they were doing that in the Bakken. They were doing a cleanup in the Bakken for a while, and we were seeing just an incredible amount of churn inside of one API, change to another, change to another, change. Like within one day, we had a series of like 12 records of change deletes. You know, A changed to B, B changed to C, C changed to E, E changed back to F, F changed back to A, and it was you just tracking through this, thinking there's just no way we got this right. You know, in most cases it worked just fine, but then in some cases we had an internal source that had provided data that had an internal version on that well, and we couldn't change it because now we had an internal source that was using the same API for a particular E key, and we had to stop the process, roll it back, and go figure out what to do with the internal source. You know, we eventually came up with a different way to do that, but that was sort of a good lesson for us. Like, holy crow, what do we do with this? If you have 6 different sources connected to something that IHS on Thursday decides to change from one API to another, you have to think carefully about what you want to happen there. And right now what we're going to do is we're going to, it's the right answer or not, and it depends, I guess, how we have things set up. In most cases, we will try to honor the IHS change if at all possible. There are cases where they are deleting the well, and that poses a very different challenge, where we will probably then contact you and say, IHS is deleting 5 wells that you still have proprietary data for. What do you want to do? Do you want us to leave them on that E key? And what we do for now, we've decided now, is we've decided to leave that E key in place with that API. And it's just up to you to figure out when that well is removed, do you want to do it? And I know Devon now has an internal process where they delay their IHS loads by 2 days to give them time to absorb all of the IHS change deletes and deal with them appropriately internally before they load Pearl's data against it. Because you can delay Pearl's by up to 2 calendar days to give you a little time to figure that out internally before the IHS data rolls through. That gets a little crazy. I've seen horrible things.
So instead of using triggers, you use CDCs.
I'm sorry, use what?
CDC.
We use triggers right now. And that's just our current approach. And I don't know if there will be a change to that or not. As we move closer into having an elastic database, we may change our strategy on how we do this. In terms of having, like the net delta of a sync process or something, work on that. That would require us then to have a duplicate data structures, where one is changed and one isn't, and then we sync them and decide the delta. And that takes a lot of space and a lot of resources. In some cases, it's quicker, though, if you have the space. There's probably 10 ways to do this, but keep in mind the well audit view is dependent on the code in the database that said, here's what to do when I have a well audit. Or I'm sorry, here's how to create the well audit view. Use this code, pass in all this information, and this EIQ source, when I mentioned that modified by date, if EIQ source is, if audit source is not being populated, then EIQ source, which is displayed as modified by, will not be displayed. So if you find that there's a blank value out there and you look at your well audit view and I say, okay, which one says modified by? This one. EIQ source, you can backtrack from here if you're looking into an issue and you can say, in the well audit view, modified by is blank. What's going on? You can look in here and say, okay, it's EIQ source that comes in from this view. So look at this view and say it's EIQ source. That comes from the PPDM audit history table. PAH is PPDM audit history. And it's called audit source. How is that populated? You can start working your way backward. But that's how things daisy chain together. Was that too deep? Do you want more in that? I really don't want to talk all day about it. I could. But we can probably move on. We are running a little bit ahead because I think we got a little bit started on views this morning. And we are scheduled to have a little break very soon. I won't go into the next topic until then. But I could also answer other questions that have cropped up in the meantime. You asked another good question right after the last break, Brian, and I don't remember what it was. Part of it was about the operator history.
The question was about aliasing on does that happen? Does aliasing happen? So, can I search? So that's one question. Is there aliasing? Second question is, can I search for an operator and get results?
Good questions. Let's take a look. These are some of the oldest pages in TDM. Brian, you might remember these. Many of these have not changed over time. They haven't had to change. Can you give me an example of one? Okay. Okay, so we have here, and I don't know if we have a good alias set up for any of these in our system. These are some of the many spellings of Chesapeake. These are some of the sub-holding companies as well. Some of them are legitimately different. But you may have, 17 ways to spell Chesapeake. Not good. So if you have 17 ways to spell Chesapeake and you would like to have them aliased to a value, that's not a good example. If we say Chesapeake Oil should be aliased. Okay.
That is just looking at the business associate table.
Yes.
Is that business associate table the same table that's referenced for initial?
Here's how to find out. If you were to look in your result views, sorry, I'm in the wrong thing. If you were to look in result views.config for initial operator comes from EIQ operator. If I look for EIQ operator, backtracking to EIQ query results view, let's bring that up again. EIQ query results view. BA name from the BA table is what I see coming up here. If I do the same thing for current operator, I sort of use the result views.config as a reference table, and the same thing with completion to go backwards from, right? Because it tells you what I'm seeing in front of me is here in both result views and the views, and for the create completion for the well level manager, well level editor. So now if I'm looking for current operator, so current operator comes from the EIQ well query results view too. So if I look for that there, pull this off, EIQ current operator, okay, current operator is going to come, like you said, it's coming from the production side and we're bringing it in. That's it. Okay. That's a very good question. So, but we are looking for, sorry, this is like 3 levels deep here. BA name is still the ultimate source for that. BA and business associate is ultimately the source for both of those. So if you alias it on the business associate side to a BA alias, that will hold true no matter whether you're looking at initial or current, because they come from the same place. And that will be aliased in both places. So when you look back at TDM, and you look at Chesapeake Oil, I'm trying to find one where we have a good alias. Let me look at one place. For those of you who have used TDM for a while, the admin application that used to be accessible here, next to that is now the reference data. That was a change we made to make the reference data accessible to people who were not admins so they could see at least what was happening. Okay, so I don't think we put business associate in here. And I don't know that we put it in here either. Yes. We've tried to keep, excuse me, we've tried to keep things that have larger impact in terms of constraints to other tables out of this editor. For example, some of the work we've done around blending, the PDS, SPL hierarchy, and core now exist only in that management screen, no longer in the reference data screens here. Same thing with business associate alias. BA alias now exists only in the BA alias, only in this screen. Okay. So trying to think of one here that would have, I can do a quick search for it and look for it later. And we can find an example and go through it. Why don't we take a break, and I will look for that, and we can come back after the break and check it out. Oops, sorry. Sorry. I'm trying to remember where that is. Yeah.
Instead of having the target table as the PPT, can you have it in the house? Just yourself server in the house, maybe like a data box. Can you do it?
I don't think that the loader would manage it. Because I think there are constraints within the loader itself on what databases it can manage. You would have to define your data mart database structure and connections to it and constraints within it within loader itself. So I don't know if it's simple enough as an API to use loader to go from place to place. IQ Exchange might be a better product for that. Because you could then define within IQ Exchange what structure was on the from and which was on the to, and say one versus the other. Loader, I think, is pretty fussy, and it's an older product about what it can connect to and what it's constrained to. Not to say it can't be done, but I don't know if it would be very simple or worth your time. It might be simpler to use IQ Exchange.
Okay, just because of the constraints, right?
Correct.
Because I know it's the underlying is SQL Server, so versus just the constraints.
Yeah, or you could write an ETL, bring it out and bring out an export into a defined structure and write just an integration into it. So what kind of thing are you looking to do?
Yeah, because I was looking at, just like you said with the loaders, you can have all the Excel files, and it's like we just acquire some, assets. If we have everything coming here, at least past them that we can handle within, then we can just, have it in the data max, go into the data max. Because we already, some of the transformations are in there.
What do you use the data mart for?
Just to store, and eventually we provide a feed to some of the business functions.
Why not bring it right out of TDM?
Well, at the same time, the issue is because we have some, restriction we want to put on it, which we don't need to then be able to do that for us. So that's what we're saying.
A restriction like what?
In terms of viewership, because this is new to me, which I'm sure a lot of people probably don't know they could do some of those stuff.
Yeah.
I was discussing with my colleague, like, oh, this makes life easy. So, because I'm new to TDM. So I'm getting to say, like, oh, instead of me having to design all those packages, we have something that's good to go almost,
Oh, yeah.
So,
you could create a
when
view.
I go talk to my manager and tell her, like, hey, we have some of these jobs. And,
Who's your manager?
Randy.
Okay.
Because of course we want to get our MDM now from you, so we're working on that.
I don't know why you wouldn't want MDM after seeing what it can do now. It's pretty unbelievable. If you go on the homepage and you were to export, I have 25 things here. If I want to export them, what you could do, if you defined a view of exactly what Data Mart wanted to consume from TDM, and you can output that in a view, that view would appear here. In a second, it will come up. Boy, it's really working today. Holy moly. And suppose you wanted all of these records, I don't think you want all these records. I don't think it'll let me deselect them. But in any case, let me just do something real quick. I don't think I want to do that. I'm going to just bring up a really small set, just so we can actually get a result back within a minute.
Okay.
I have some really small ones I used to test with. And 9 records, far more workable. And I'm going to bring this back in the Export Manager from the beginning. If you bring them into anything you have selected, checkmarked, will come in here and you still have the option to remove it over here. So it's going to come in with 9 checkmarked, and suppose I want all 9. If I had a view called, Data Mart Export 1, I would, click here to see a preview of what that looked like and go, yep, I want all that. Or I want to filter that way, and I want to make this column come first and this column come next. And then you hit export. You're going to get an export. And right now it's set to go to an XLSX file, not a CSV file. And you can then have that data available to bring into whatever it is that you want to bring it into. So you could do it that way in terms of taking a spreadsheet or CSV file out of here and importing that into something else, or just create a pipeline with IQ Exchange and define the format on both ends and have it just go from one to the other. Much easier.
That's what I was thinking, because since we can use the loader to load the Excel files into TDM, and actually you have some of the transformations you were talking about. So it's all set. And I would love the output.
Yeah.
And we can actually just export the output, because that's what I was thinking.
Right off the bat, you can do a spreadsheet, without any work. That's right there.
We already have the spreadsheets, and
But having it in TDM first is cool, and then you can always pull a spreadsheet from that out to whatever. Yeah, that's really cool. I hope you guys can use more of TDM, because I think as an organization, you guys have struggled with getting the data right for so long and getting it complete from all the acquisitions. And now I think you're finally at the point where you can focus on using it more.
Yeah.
Being analytical about it instead of just getting it in there.
Yeah, that's right. Because what we're essentially trying to do is to have, a storage system in-house, that can actually, we can use to then create any kind of view we want for reporting purposes, for, a lot of other things. We have Spotfire.
There are people that have 60 views on their list, because everybody wants something different, and they've created views for everybody. And they can use some of them in bulk editor to purposely manage the data up front, correct it where they have to. And some of them are just for the purposes of exporting. I want to export to 7 different systems, give me 7 export views of what exactly they want to consume, and then just run them. Oh yeah, I think you know enough today to at least start creating views.
Yeah. I mean, exploring it using TDM is something that would be new, which is not crazy, but
if you're comfortable going behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest part.
Yeah.
Because if I can go into the server itself and just make changes, I think.
Yeah, if you know what the heading is, like modified by, find out what the heading says, where is the heading defined in result views, what view does it use, what column is it pulling, go to the database, what column is that, and where does it come from? You can track back the provenance of that data all the way back to the beginning. And even if you wanted to, how it got there. You could find out where that is, where the particular value is for that attribute in a record, and then find out, did that record come in through Loader or Pearls or WML?
That's right.
Who loaded it? When did it get there? You just go all the way back.
Yeah, that's one thing I would go try out.
Yeah, I think we need actually a view that does that. The more I'm thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we had a view that let you click through and see the whole history of how a piece of data got there?
That's right. It would be nice.
I know. That would be great. That'd be a lot of work. And if I say anything, I'm going to have to do it. So, but I think it would be a nice enhancement.
Yeah, that's a good product. Yes, exactly.
I know. I like it. Yeah. I don't know if I can answer this BA question. Your problem's Brian, I couldn't. I'm not sure if I know where that
I'll
is.
get your card so I can buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. I will give that to you. I might have one right here. Let me find one. My card has the wrong title. It's been wrong for about 2.5 years, but I'm not sure what my title is right now. I think it's technical writer. Although I spend about 10% of my time doing that. We all do many things. I have brought a stack of cards. Oh, sorry, in here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I have a bunch here if you guys need them. Yeah. Can you pass one in? You're here if you need it. It's the right phone number and email. It's the wrong title. Depends what I'm doing that day. What is my Laptop is not smart. Oh, don't have any aliases.
I know, it's like real sugar, real butter.
I know. If I make cookies at my house, they're gone within like 2 hours. If I ever see them. And you think it's my 19-year-old son, my giant 6-foot-tall, big weird son. It's my 14-year-old daughter. She'll have like 400 cookies. Just like, okay, where'd the cookies go? I don't know. Just like a little vacuum. I don't know how to eat that much. And she's a ballerina, so she weighs like, she's bruising. That's You're crazy. I know. It's so funny to watch me. You're like, where are you putting that? My son would just sit down in a cereal box. She's not that sick. I'm hungry, Mom. I did not find anything because I'd forgotten we'd freshly loaded this database on this server for testing this release, and we didn't find any databases for VA yet, but I will play with it and let you know. I think there's more to it than meets the eye.
I read the original. What about this? You literally like to take this. You cool.
I promise to tell you what I've been able to extract from my kids. They know how it works, but how it works is a little bit of magic. You have it down? Broke it enough times that I figured out how it works. Usually get these, like, just a quick snipe from somebody after my going, are you doing something right now? This is one real exactly what you just did. So that's why I deleted the entire CSS by accident. It was just a moment of, when you have the moment when you're working on the system, and you just have that moment of sheer cold sweat, where you're like, roll back, roll back. Oh my God, it's SQL Server, I can't. Yes, I had to run 32 install scripts in order to recreate it. Because we apparently didn't take a backup for our test server. So we have something to take care of. We now take a backup. It took me 2 hours to figure out in order all of the install scripts over time eternal that created the blending table itself. Because it has all these, and I'll talk about the links that are in there and the relationships it has with it itself that you have to make sure stay, that we over time finally got right with alter table and insert statements just to get it straight. So I know it pretty well. I know how to ruin it and I know how to get it back. But you only learn from your failures. Truly learn. Ask you a question. That's all that I was just correcting. You might save me a ticket. Okay. Which I would have to answer tomorrow. People got it today.
So I deleted, or attempted to delete a well version. I got an error. It was the only well version in this E key if it existed.
Okay.
So, and it gave me an error. Went back to the well component table. So then I go check the well component table and I have Aries entry. Aries entries. Well component table for that E key.
Well, tell it not well project.
Well component. Which tells me that probably an Aries version existed on that E one.
Yeah.
But now that,
It might have been orphaned.
so can I just delete those entries from that well component table? My Aries version is over here, it's all good in this other E.
Well component again is used without.
Just delete it.
I would be very careful. There are times where I think you and others have loaded documents, logs, images, other things that are documents and logs of various types to a well where we have not had a UE and source relationship to a well version. So in other words, no matter what version or what source version created the well, other documents from other sources and other logs from other sources have loaded to that well just fine. They load to the well, not the well version. So regardless of whether there was an Aries source well version record, we may have an Aries document loaded to that well, or an Aries log. So Aries wouldn't have that, right? So do be careful on that. If you say, well, I can just leave that because they may intentionally. I would have to, I'm sorry, I'm just not remembering what well company. Oh, so you're using the minimum. What is the well company?
So this top, this thing here, this top four rows.
Oh, it came in from a bunch of loader jobs. Those are your integration.
Yeah. This, I mean, I know this top, I'll check.
It looks on the surface like those were just
Because there are,
stranded
I
children.
think so too, because they're in the new week.
Yeah. I think that's what the story is.
I'll check.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, we're going to back up and go a little bit, before we talk about, right now we're on enhanced blending and aliases, and I should have put a comment in there, I meant enhanced blending and blending aliases. Brian asked a great question I don't have an answer to yet on the BA, but I'll look that up and we can send that out when we figure out what that is. For those who are not familiar with blending and aggregation, it's probably worth backing up a step and talking about blending and aggregation and what they are and how they work. Thank you for bringing up markers, Tina. This is the part of the program where my hands are covered in marker. Everything in TDM, when you have your golden record and then all of your version records, like source 1 and source 2, and then the well record. Anytime you have a well that's constructed, it was constructed by creating, a completion up to a well bore, up to a well, and then blending over from there. So at every level, at every source, for every source, I'm going to have wells, well bores, and completions. So the first thing that happens is I blend up. I aggregate up to create parents. And then once I've created parents and fleshed out the entire well level system, I'm then going to blend over attribute by attribute. Except for node, that's separate, that's a different thing. Except that you guys spent 7 million Energy IQ bucks yesterday for us to change that. We're all pretty happy about that. So hopefully that will fix a lot of things that have been confusing over time. The thing to keep in mind though is if you make a change to a completion, what happens is we wipe out the well bore and we recreate it. Because we have to rerun the aggregation rules that create the well bore and that create the well.
So to be clear, aggregation always is good.
Yes. We wipe it out and we rebuild it. That's one of the reasons I think I mentioned earlier that the row change by, we have a rule that prevents you from modifying an aggregation created record. So we always will rebuild the wellbore, and then we'll reblend everything over. No, that prevents us from changing. So there's a rule that runs on, in the rule set that I showed earlier, we have a rule that stops loader from changing a record that's been created by aggregation. We don't ever want to be changing an aggregation created record. Now, if you have a wellbore you inserted, that was, Brian Sagafield created record, that's fine. It can change it if you say that's okay, and there's no rule preventing it. But we do have a rule that prevents loader from changing a wellbore created by the aggregation process, because we want the aggregation process alone to manage that record. We don't want to ever wipe out data that you, as a client, load to a wellbore, knowing that aggregation is going to wipe it out and recreate it. If we then wiped it out and recreated it, we would lose your data. So we don't want you to ever be able to put data on that record purposely. So aggregation is up, blending is over. Everything that goes up is controlled by aggregation rules. Have you guys played with those at all? Most of the time they're out of the box and no one ever changes them. But you can. So the aggregation rules, take a quick half step back just to make sure we understand the up and the over. Aggregation rules exist between two component levels, between completion and wellbore, wellbore and well. And Steve swears that there's an instance where completion to well makes sense. I asked him to prove it to me and he couldn't, so, I believe him that, maybe it's possible that you can have a well completion attached to a well. And actually, we just worked with a client, I can't remember who it was anymore, for whom wellbores didn't even make sense. They don't even acknowledge that well, but they don't have geoscience involved in their project yet. So they have no use for wellbores. We create them anyway, but they don't have to ever look at them or deal with them or use them.
Well, they were saying yesterday, always put the wellbore in there because you don't know
Always
what
put it in.
the future is going to be.
Exactly. Even though geoscience isn't part of the conversation right now, they will be. If you have, any hope of knowing the location of the well or what it's producing or what it's, what area it's in or what geographic area it's in, or geologic area is, you need it. So the rules we have out there, here's one that I understand a little better than others, is we have a rule that says if I had multiple completions, and you've seen 5 or 6 completions on a wellbore, others, I've seen quite a few as well, then take the data in the aggregation columns over here and promote it to the wellbore for the completion that has the latest drill total depth in well version. So pick the well version that has, the biggest total depth, or the lowest total depth, right? The biggest, deepest total depth. And for that completion, promote the total depth unit of measure. And that's a pretty simple example. More realistic examples are completion dates. There's a ton of data tied to completion date. So if I have multiple completions with different completion dates, I want to use the most recent one. And I want to use the data from the most recent well version to promote that information.
I want to create a wellbore.
And if you have a wellbore to wellbore relationship for a sidetrack, so if I have a wellbore to wellbore, again, the same thing. You would use these rules, and we have a wellbore to wellbore relationship already defined.
This aggregation is,
This has been out for a long time. You should have these. Yeah, I think you have these somewhere. So you'll find them under admin, under aggregation. And they most of the time exist and no one ever changes them. We have, however, because of well auxiliary, had to change them. So we now have well auxiliary. We needed to mention this. I didn't have slides on this, I don't think, but you probably should know this. Now we have well aux rules for this as well. So there's now well aux aggregation rules, because not only do we have, wells, wellbores, and completions for well, we have the same thing for well aux. EIQ well aux. Just keep saying that to yourself when you're typing SQL, or you'll never find the table. So well aux has the same thing. It has completion to wellbore, wellbore to well, completion to well, wellbore to wellbore. It has the same set of rules because that information, ideally we would have just created one, but because we actually named the table, we made them separate. Ideally we would have had one header, completion header to wellbore header, including well version and well aux. But because the tables are actually physically involved in this, we had two separate ones, one for well aux version, one for well version. And actually these exist out there, they're out there in another table, so they come physically from there. But we've had to also do this to deal with all of the information that we see coming through in the well aux table. And as you add, so if you were to go ahead and use other fields that are out there as available to populate data into that currently are sort of blank and undefined, make sure that the aggregation rules that relate to that data that you populate into those well aux fields reflect what you really want to have happen, because right now, by default, we have all of those aggregating based on the version with the latest row change date. So just make sure that that makes sense for the data you put in those well aux fields. Does that make sense? Aggregation is kind of it's not a mystery, but some people aren't completely clear on what goes on there. Aggregation will fire if you make a change to a record. The change to that record will trigger aggregation to happen. Essentially, if you change anything about that record, aggregation will happen. It used to happen differently way back when. You used to have to change the row change date in order for it to happen. We now have it as a trigger out there on well version and on well aux version. And that trigger will put that record in the aggregation queue in Energy IQ schema. In the Energy IQ schema, we have PDS aggregation queue, which is where all those records sit until the scheduler service goes and plucks them out and runs them. And sometimes that happens in less than a second, and sometimes it takes 5 seconds, depending on what's going on your server. And it'll put them in there and process them based on an event date. What I have had to do when we are aggregating an entire database on stuff that I wanted to see right away was to physically change the event date in the aggregation queue to be earlier to bump my stuff up. Should probably never have to do that, but it processes it on a first in, first out. So as they roll in, because what you want to have happen is you want all of the components for a well to kind of go in order. You want it to make sense. So you want those to process in order. Once aggregation happens, it will then trigger off the blending process. And blending does not happen in a queue, only aggregation.
Is that fires all the time on the trigger? Data that you bring into other objects that make you tell you, look, how do you keep it from overriding and deleting that? How do you rebuilding that tree structure?
By source. And it will only happen on things that are created and managed by aggregation. So if you have well view data coming in at the wellbore level, we're never going to re-trigger an aggregation from completion to wellbore, but we will create the well. We will delete the well and recreate it. If If you change that well view record, change comes in here at the wellbore level, we'll delete the well, sorry, that's a well. We'll delete the well and recreate it based on the many possible wellbores that could exist for a well. And I believe we have a rule out there that says, or maybe not, I think at one time we considered having a rule that said if this is the only wellbore on the well, don't run it, just copy it. And I think we actually have that in the logic, where it will actually just move
So
it.
really aggregation happens from wellbore, completion of wellbore, well, by source.
Yes. Aggregation happens in a silo by source. It does not happen across sources. That would be really dangerous. And then once that happens, we line up all the silos side by side and we run blending. So the blending we're going to talk about. So this is important. If you add aux data, check the aggregation rules and make sure that that makes sense for all the data that you're adding. If you're adding data that might be associated with a drilling event, maybe you should use deepest drill depth or latest drill date instead of row change. I mean, maybe there's something else you should do. So the blending that happens, this is the cool stuff. If it comes back, okay. We can actually hit the PowerPoint at this point, and then I'll show you what this is. We're calling it enhanced blending because we did some fun stuff with allowing blending levels to happen. The reason we created blending levels initially was our work with HUD, where we had the need to have different blending orders depending on the well life cycles. And we wanted to set up the life cycles as blending levels. We also wanted to set up operatorship as a blending level, one within the other. So we decided the easiest way to do that was to make it a configurable structure that no matter what you wanted to do, you could set up blending levels based on blended and aggregated tables only. So you only want to set up a blending level on golden record stuff. You don't want to set up a blending level on well version, you want to only set it up on well. And I'll explain that. And Krista said, please mention this when you talk to people. Every change to the blending hierarchy regenerates the blending procedure that's used to blend anything in the TDM database schema. So if you were to change or move the order of two blending sources in your blending hierarchy, in your blending sources, saving that change actually regenerates the whole blending procedure. It's a dynamically regenerated thing that will then, from then on, change things that are blended. You need to be very careful that if you make a change that has an impact on records that you blended last week, that you reblend those records from last week. So making changes to the blending hierarchy is not to be done on a casual basis. You have to carefully think about, if I now move areas up in front of WellView for this particular data field, how many records would be impacted by that? And based on when I plan to make that change, do I have time to blend all those records or reblend all those records with that change in mind? So if you said for well name, I now wanted for this particular life cycle phase, WellView to be preferenced higher than Aries, very plausible. I'm now going to want to go look for all of the records that have well name populated for Aries and WellView. If I only have Aries or only have WellView, I don't need to do anything because I just changed their order. But if I have both, chances are those were reblended last week, and I now want to say if one of those values should have popped over the other, I want to reblend them. Except if those values are the same, it won't matter. You always want to minimize the amount of things you have to reblend, because it takes database resources.
Can I say that back to you, make sure I understand?
Yes, please.
If I have the workflow defined, with the life cycle of the well, and I have that defined, and I want to change an order of that. I change the sequence of what my primary source of record is.
Yes.
I do that, it will rebuild the blending.
Procedure.
Blending procedure, it doesn't go automatically run the database.
Correct.
It just changes procedure.
Correct.
In those.
Correct.
And I have to manually go back and run the whole thing.
Right now, that is true. Krista and I are both a little bit concerned about that, and are chatting with our development team to say this is dangerous. Because when folks do this, they don't always remember. I still have 6,000 records that I brought in, that I integrated last month, that have a completely different blending order that doesn't suit my current wants and needs. So I need to go reblend those. So at the very least, we're looking for an easier way to identify those records, whether it's a page or a view or a stored procedure. And yeah, I mean, we're looking at all kinds of options. That would be a great idea. On how to figure out, like, okay, were these done prior to my making that change? And which of them really are at risk? Ones that have both values populated, where both values are different. Like, that would probably be the, the scope of things that had to get re-triggered to reblend. So she said, please, I get this question all the time on site, and people change things and they forget, and it's hard to go explain when they say, well, my blending isn't right. Well, that's because you just changed the blending order and you didn't reblend records that you integrated last month that were not touched since then. So they didn't use those preferences. So of course they look wrong, because they are wrong. You need to reblend them. The way you do that is you actually just touch that record in any way, shape, or form, because there is a blending, there is a trigger, there is an update trigger. I probably even know the name of it. It's like EIQWNV, or blending after. After an update, run blending again. So you actually can just set active indicator equal active indicator for those records, which makes no essential change, but it triggers the trigger to happen. That is a question we get at least once a week from at least one client. My blending doesn't look right. Did you just change your blending procedure? Yes. Did you identify records that needed to be reblended? No. Did we tell you that? No. So now we're telling you. Please deal with that.
Does that happen
Often enough. Blending is something that it should be almost a set it and forget it, unless you have a major organizational change in terms of data governance, deciding that there needs to be something different. And data governance normally moves slow enough that you have enough time to prepare for that. It's usually rather bureaucratic, rather, a lot of people deciding on one little thing, and then finally it happens.